Okay, appreciate all those introductions. If somebody comes in or if we miss somebody, feel free to chime in. But I think it's important that you heard these people's names and what schools they're at. And if you can turn on your video, that would be great, or put a picture of yourself, but that's okay if you can't. So this group is something that we really want to grow strongly over the next few years. Our accelerated courses are growing strongly in a few schools, but not very widespread. And last year, we made somewhat of an effort to increase the level of sixth grade accelerated courses across the district with some success, not to the degree that I'd hoped. And but anyway, it's just something we really want to push because this is a big component of equity across our district so that all of our schools can ultimately offer these accelerated courses and have an eighth grade algebra course on their campus. Ideally, these accelerated courses are strong to enhance that algebra process, that algebra class, once those kids get to that point in eighth grade. I will say, however, and I don't want to make too big of a deal about this, but our experience is that even if the accelerated classes aren't super strong, we still tend to have a fairly good degree of success with eighth grade algebra 1. The prime example of that is 4 years ago, we started the first eighth grade algebra 1 classes, or one class the first year at Walnut Hill. And they had no accelerated courses prior to the start of that class, and I was very concerned. But in talking with the principal, he was really adamant about doing this at the time, and so we supported it. And it turned out their test scores for that one group of 30 kids were phenomenal. They were just very capable. I think the kids saw their placement into eighth grade algebra 1 as an honor, and it sort of was an issue of pride maybe in their minds. And they took it seriously and worked hard. We had great teaching out there. And ever since they've added a class now, I think they're at 2 full classes of Algebra 1 and just haven't missed a beat. It's been phenomenal. And those kids, I think, feel empowered in a way that they wouldn't have been otherwise. So, you know, I'm saying that to say that the accelerated courses are extremely important, but without them flowing as well as they can, it's still possible to do eighth grade Algebra 1. What I would say in the case of Walnut Hill is with taking into account the degree of success we had with that eighth grade algebra first class, I just wondered how much higher the scores would have been if we had accelerated classes for those kids to come through initially. So I think, in an ideal world, we have these accelerated courses that identify incoming sixth graders and, really beef up their skills in a way that they wouldn't have been in a regular sixth grade class. Put them into a seventh grade accelerated course. Those who are ready to move on. I'm sure that there'll probably be a few in most schools that might drop off after that sixth grade accelerated and just go into a regular seventh grade class. But hopefully the vast majority of those will go into a seventh grade accelerated class, continue to beef up those skills and be even more prepared to have higher levels of success in Algebra 1. So that's the goal. And we want this to be on every campus in Caddo. Obviously, Caddo Magnet, Uri, some of our higher performing schools, Walnut Hill now, are doing a great job with this already. There's a good process in place, but most of our other schools, that process is not there. And so we just really want to make that happen. So for those of you who are here who are at schools that didn't have sixth grade accelerated math or seventh grade accelerated math this past year, super excited to have you on, excited to have everyone on, because we need to have a team as we move forward of people kind of hashing this out. And that's what this session is about today. To sort of talk through some things, not a ton of, information to give you. There'll be a little bit, but mainly just to have some conversations. So what we're wanting to do is give you an opportunity to compare what those of you who have taught these courses in the past, kind of compare your approaches to these courses. So there's going to be some questions in a minute that ask you about that. If you have not taught these classes before and you see those questions, please answer according to kind of what you would envision, okay? And then we're going to do a quick assessment of the potential unfinished learning that we talked about yesterday at the 10 a.m. session. And we'll get to that. I'll tell you more about that when we get there. And then, we're going to hopefully at least give you the tools to start developing course plans. So here's what we're going to start with. We want to describe what accelerated middle school math has looked like for you in prior years. Okay, so this is going to be some think time and give you an opportunity to input some things. Again, for those of you who have not taught accelerated middle school math courses in the past, then just sort of kind of theorize on this. Please feel free to put your answers in, but maybe it'll be a little more theoretical. So here we go with Nearpod. What % of each course do you normally cover in a school year? Or for those of you who haven't taught these courses before, kind of what would you anticipate? So if whether you're teaching 6th grade accelerated, then that would be some 6th grade math and 7th grade math. Or if you're teaching the 7th grade accelerated, that would be 7th and 8th grade math.
Hey, Roger, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Okay, so, and this might be really dumb, so I apologize, but what is the difference between like a magnet class and like an accelerated class?
Okay, well, every school kind of labels things a little differently. So I don't know exactly what you mean. When you say magnet class, now we have we have Caddo Middle Magnet School.
Like I had a magnet class last year at Keithville.
Okay. Yeah.
And I just wasn't quite sure.
Yeah. So what I would say there, Harley, is it sounds like that it's the difference between honors and enriched and general. And those things typically are going to need to be defined at your school between you and your administration. Okay. And I'm happy to get involved in those conversations as to what those should look like. I know for some of our high school courses, we actually have separate scope and sequence documents for honors, enrich, general classes. The reason we don't do that for middle school courses is because everybody has to take the same test. Like for Algebra 2 in high school, there's no spring test. So we try to differentiate what an honors class or a magnet class might look like compared to a general level Algebra 2 class. In middle school, it's, I would say, since we all have to teach the same material and the kids all have to take the same test, I would say for an enriched or honors or magnet class, you would just hopefully have a better opportunity to keep up the pace and even throw in some enrichment activities, maybe a project-based learning lesson or something like that from time to time. Maybe higher expectations on homework, those kinds of things, than you might in a general class. But again, in middle school, all the kids have to take the same test, so that's why we just have one 6th grade scope and sequence, one 7th, one 8th. And then, so I guess that's a little vague, but yeah, just talk to me individually about that, or we can talk to Ms. Wall and Ms. Morris over there at Donnie Bickham and try to define that a little more clearly if we need to. Great question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Amanda Wall, Amanda Waddell, I just said Amanda Wall for Donnie Bickham. Amanda Waddell is saying you expect to teach 100% of the 6th grade material in a 6th grade accelerated class. And let's go ahead and have some verbal input on this, if you don't mind. You can unmute your mics here.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing, like Cheris put, for 7th grade accelerated, I'm assuming she's going to teach all of 7th grade, and she's hoping to teach about 40% of the 8th grade material. Okay.
Roger, can I say something about
the
7th grade accelerated? In order to have them ready for Algebra 1, you need to hit the basics of slope, and kind of talk to them about what does the slope form look like, y equals mx plus b. They need to have heard that multiple times. You can teach that throughout the whole year.
Sure.
Like when you're talking about a cell phone plan or whatever, whenever those things come up, kind of just like let them hear it. I don't mean like teach a full lesson on it, just like let them hear it over and over and over, so that when they get to Algebra 1 and you start that first, they don't call it chapter, but that first chapter on Springboard, bam, you have a word problem on slope.
Right, exactly. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to specific topics, but I just wanted to kind of do this general question first. But a great point that we are going to hit on pretty hard here in a minute. So I'm seeing this 40% number, 30% number, 25% number. I would say if everything was ideal and we had all this extra time to do, then what we would want to do is set up for the 6th grade accelerated course, obviously to be able to teach all the 6th grade content and roughly half of the 7th grade content. Now, I know why teachers are not putting 50% or more on there, because that's kind of unrealistic. And then also, if we're getting them ready for 8th grade Algebra 1, I think this goes back to, was it Sharon that was just talking?
That was Sharon Allen.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And what kind of goes back to what Sharon was just saying, that it also depends on what content you're talking about, because I know for the 7th grade accelerated teachers, sometimes the tendency is to leave off the geometry and focus more on the algebra. which makes a lot of sense. But what I'm saying, and just if you're just looking at it numerically and trying to break things apart, break those three courses, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math apart, then what we would do on the surface is we would say, okay, let's teach all of 6th grade and half of 7th for that 6th grade accelerated course. And then when those kids move on to 7th grade accelerated, we teach the rest of 7th and all of 8th. And that way they've had all their middle school math by the time they finish 7th grade. And then they would go into Algebra 1 as an 8th grader. Again, the problem with that is it's not realistic with regard to the time constraints, and it's not absolutely necessary because, and I would say for a lot of reasons. Let me hear from you. Does anybody have some thoughts on that before we move off of this slide?
Well, that is unrealistic to say a whole year and a half of another. But with careful planning, you can skip a lot of those lessons. You know, if you have an accelerated class where they really think, you know, you can get almost to 50%. But that comes with time. Somebody that's teaching accelerated for the first time, don't be hard on yourself if you don't get 50% of it. If you can just get them, you know, as far in there as you can, and let the next teacher know. You know, that's what I find a lot. Our school has excellent math team communication. Like, we have the best. We talk to each other and we say, look, this is where I left off. This is where they were weak. In the past, I've worked in some areas that there was no discussion. You had no clue what they left off with, what they knew. But again, we have excellent communication, and I think that's key.
Yep.
I would agree. I'm sorry. Am I talking? Can you hear me, Roger?
Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I really agree with Sharon. Communication is key. I know my 7th grade advanced, so where my kids are going, when we went into virtual learning this year, it was very clear that I wasn't going to be able to effectively introduce 7th grade material because we didn't really have books, you know, when everything kind of went on digital. So we sat down and we worked out a plan as to what would be key for the kids to know next year. And that way they're not completely just blindsided when they get in her class.
Very good. Yeah, so it's not just, so the percent question, as you can see, was just sort of a starter thing. And it's not necessarily the best way to approach this, right? So now let's think about this. Let's get a little more specific. Some topics. So again, we've got two different courses meeting at one time here, the 6th grade accelerated and the 7th grade accelerated. But what would you consider in either of those courses that you teach, if you haven't taught them, just kind of on your own thoughts, to be the high priority topics? And Sharon's already mentioned some. And those of you who aren't able to type on your device or computer, you can give some verbal responses here.
Well, slope, of course, I mentioned, but algebra, you know, and if we all, I've tried to talk to my elementary teachers at our school before, and they just kind of, I don't know, ignore me or something. We use the vocabulary the same throughout. And in 6th grade, I know Miss Corbel talks about algebra. You know, that's a scary word. Those kids that first come into middle school, they're terrified of the word algebra.
I think the elementary teachers are terrified of that word as well.
Well, that's my favorite subject, but
in general, I see that elementary teachers tend to be afraid of math. And I say afraid. You know, when I worked with elementary teachers that year, I just found that I had several just tell me straight up, look, I hate math. I'm willing to teach it, but I hate it. Well, that's not a good start there. So.
Well, they must have not had a good teacher somewhere along the line. But if we talk the vocabulary, like, I mean, 1st grade, they're doing algebra. What's the missing number? I had so many. What's the missing number? You know.
Yep.
Vocabulary is important.
Okay. And you mentioned algebra, and that's kind of broad. But again, if we're thinking about preparing these kids for 8th grade Algebra 1, then it makes sense that algebra, the big domain of algebra, should be at least a priority, if not the priority. And so I guess what I'm asking here is, what are some specific topics there? And even if you have some ideas on specific topics outside of the algebra domain, that would be important?
Solving equations. I see my kids still having trouble solving equations. You know, they can play around with the numbers and get it, but they need to know, you know, that it's inverse operations. Yep. And that's another thing. Rules that we use. I know Ms. Corbel and I have talked a lot about, they don't know their divisibility rules.
Okay, so even going back prior to middle school, right?
Right. I'm not
So
sure where that's taught, but that's the first thing we talk about in 6th grade is the divisibility rules. How do I know that his number is divisible by?
Right. So let me read some of these because I know not everyone is able to see a screen right now, but 6th grade, expressions, equations, ratio rate, unit rate, which actually when you think about the ratio rate, unit rate, that's the lead in to the slopes that Sharon's talking about. Fraction, decimal, percent, percentage, fluency, concepts of integers. Yeah, and I think everybody would argue the integer point there, right? That goes kind of basic. 7th grade accelerated needs strong two-step equation work. So that was actually going to be my next question if nobody had mentioned it. So Charis, I appreciate you mentioning that. To what degree, I think Sharon mentioned equations. And so the follow-up is going to be to what degree do we need to have equations covered? And Charis is defining that as two-step equations. Beginning exponent properties, that's huge. Heavy on order of operations, which is a huge, basis of algebra. If order of operation skills and understanding is not there, algebra equations, solving equations is not going to happen, right? And again, she mentions fraction skills. Another one, the topics that are the most essential for the next grade. So Denise is kind of putting that, kind of stepping away from the specifics, which is important to do sometimes, and say, let me look at, see what's supposed to come in the next grade and what's most important there. Let me throw this question out there. How do we know, what's an easy way to identify? If I don't teach 7th grade math, I'm a 6th grade teacher, and I want to look ahead to 6th grade math, aside from talking to my teachers, 7th grade teachers at my school, what's a good way to find out what 7th grade priority material is?
Go to the 7th grade scoping sequence. If you go and see what they need to know, then when you do 6th grade and you look at 7th grade, because that's my thing right now, is I've never taught 6th grade. So I'm having to go back and look at all of the 6th grade stuff to see what I need to do, and is actually helping me because, like, Miss Waddell was at Walnut Hill 2 years ago, and so she was the 6th grade teacher. Well, I know that I had 8th graders and RTI kids that she was working with. And so the things that she was teaching them, I was able to piggyback on to get them ready for their 7th grade class and their 8th grade class. So, but I had to go look at the scoping sequence for those to make sure that, okay, whatever I teach here is going to be essential. And do I need to make sure that I do extra or I really hound on this skill because it's going to be 7th grade, and I make sure in 7th grade I really hound on this skill because that's going to be 8th grade in algebra. So going through and looking at the scoping sequence to see which ones are the most important was how I did it.
Hey, I'm going to get you to follow up on that, Denise. Here's a question for you. So I'm a new teacher, or I'm new to Caddo anyway. And when you say you're going to go to the scope and sequence, give me some more specifics. What am I looking for in that scope and sequence to help me understand what's important?
I looked for, and I'm using colors, but I looked for all the green topics because those were the ones that I knew they needed to know. And a lot of the times the green topics for all three grades are pretty much the same. They're just building on each other. So if I can make sure that I get the green topics for 6th grade down, the most essential ones that go for the state test, the ones that have to be done, then the 7th grade, it will roll into the 7th grade, and it'll also roll into the 8th grade.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anybody have anything to add to that and piggyback on that?
Yes, Roger.
Yeah, go ahead.
While we were talking about the topics, I also wanted to add about vertical alignment, making sure, for example, I think Ms. Allen talked about slope. So make sure that we use the vocabulary that goes together. So 6th grade, when we're talking about rates and ratios, and 7th grade, constant of proportionality, making sure that they understand that these topics are not independent. So then we can talk about slope and then even introduce linear equations. So they won't think that these topics are independent of each other.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we extend the lesson, we also have to sometimes fill in some gaps. And I know this year we're going to have to go back and fill in some gaps. So for example, last year I taught 6th grade. So I might need to go back to 5th grade and look at the extension to see what was the lead in, so I can make sure that they have a good foundation to build on. And then go ahead and extend those topics and those vocabularies. And then when they get to, I think Ms. Allen was talking about 8th grade, then they'll be ready for her. They'll understand, have a good conceptual understanding, and not just saying rise over run. I know that's slow.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and by the way, it was brought up yesterday that the elementary scope and sequence documents on the caddomath.org website are not up to date. So that's on my to-do list, to get with Amanda Perry and work on updating those so that we can access them, and if we need to. All right, good deal. We see rates and ratios, expressions, equations. So it seems like the general consensus is that in these accelerated courses, we need to focus on the algebra. Now, each of these courses has quite a bit of geometry involved. I would say, yes, that's probably low priority, except maybe even in the 8th grade. See, this is where it gets a little tricky, because when you're teaching the 7th grade accelerated course and you choose to leave off the geometry, that could cause them problems in a year or 2 or 3 when they take a high school geometry course. And so, we don't want to just totally leave that off unless we're just in a big time crunch. And I would say, and I think Ms. Henderson just sort of alluded to this coming year, time could be even more of an issue because of the unfinished learning. So let's move on. We could probably talk about that one thing all day. One more quick thing here, and you can either type in or just share, but just real quickly, and I may have already alluded to this a little bit, but what would you consider to be the lower priority topics? Things that you're willing to skip to move on, if you have to.
When you were talking about the geometry skills, where I see the problem is when we get to literal equations, they don't know where those formulas even came from. Like, they don't know, where did pi come from? Where area of a triangle come from? It's half of a square or half of a quadrilateral. We could just kind of, in maybe a brief lesson, show where those formulas came from. I did that in depth this last year, and my kids were so much more, knowledgeable about equations. It made a difference. And yes, I probably spent too much time on it.
We cover where a lot of those formulas come from in 6th grade in that first unit. We cover where the area for a triangle comes from, where the surface area formula comes from. So, and that is embedded into this illustrative math curriculum. So you might start seeing a pickup with that in the next few years.
And I think the cool point here, and that's why we're doing this discussion, this is amazing, is that, I was kind of referring to geometry in general as a low priority possibly, and Sharon is making a major connection between the geometry and the algebra and how important that piece is. And if they don't get that piece in 6th grade, then by the time you start trying to talk about literal equations, all they're seeing is a bunch of letters and an equal sign, and we know they're not going to be happy about that. It's going to be a struggle, right? Okay, Amanda also mentioned statistics. I wasn't thinking about that, but yeah, that's something that might be considered low priority. I'm trying to remember 6th and 7th grade statistics.
I can refresher on if you want it.
Go ahead.
They cover histogram, dot plots, box plots, and mean, median, and mode, and how those relate.
Yep.
You can teach that in 2 days. I think that's what I probably did.
Yeah, and that's what typically ends up happening is like a week and a half or so.
Yeah.
For all
you
of
don't
it.
have to spend a whole book on it.
Yeah. And those are all yellow standards, right?
Yes.
Pretty sure they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on the low priority side? 8th grade transformation.
In the 7th grade, that first unit on scale models, I've wondered, and maybe somebody else can answer this, why do we have a whole book on scale models?
A whole unit?
Yeah.
Well, I think a big part of that, and I actually heard Dr. McCullum, who's the writer of Illustrative Math, he answered a lot of questions one day in a session I attended a couple of years ago. And I think that specific topic was mentioned, and I was trying to remember how he addressed that, but he connected it to algebra. Obviously, the idea of proportionality being important when you start talking about linear functions. And
Right.
so that was his
I
connection.
agree with that, but
Yeah.
I can't remember how many lessons there are, but it's like 3 weeks on one book.
Yeah.
That's the book I typically hit, in just a few days and move on, because that's
Okay.
just too much.
So again, just things to take in for all of us, especially those of you who are new to these kinds of accelerated courses about, and I hope you're taking notes on where we might can abbreviate. Okay, let's move this on. I've got one more up here. What are some key things to consider in planning for accelerated middle school math courses? So we started off broad, we got a little more specific. And I guess some of these could be specific too, but it's kind of backing away maybe from some of the specific content we were just talking about. As you consider planning for these courses, and we need to hear, and now if you haven't taught these and you have some thoughts, please share. But I really want to hear from our experienced teachers on, what have been some of your challenges? What have been some of your successes? Those kinds of things. Let's hear a few of those. And you can type them in, or you can just share verbally. Key things to consider in planning for an accelerated middle school math course, and aside from what we've already mentioned. Okay, so Amanda posted, you're going to go fast, but you have to do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm your students, right? That may be the key principle right there.
Exactly, I agree.
So you have to smile more in your accelerated classes, right? And you have to look more relaxed because they are going to be going fast. Yeah.
Okay. Miss Waddell.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I taught with you at Walnut Hill a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the RTI baby class. So
Right.
how do you, I'm having to go from the RTI babies where you have to pull them along a little bit more to accelerated. So help me with that. How do I transition between the two? Because I'm used to going, okay, think this through, look at it again. Let's try this way. Could we do it this way? What does this say? And now they're going to be smarter than me. So how do I transition to that?
Well, I think a lot of those questions are still applicable to advanced. Sometimes where you might have students in RTI want to go a little bit faster, the advanced students go so fast that they might need to slow it down just a little bit. And you still want to see those connections. And a lot of advanced students just want to get to an answer. And it's not all of them, but you do still have to make sure to take time that they see the connections and then they see the concepts and things like that. So I think you're in a really unique position to just kind of flip it. And so you'll still be able to ask those questions just in a different context.
Okay. Because I don't want to come across like I'm making them feel stupid, like they are the RTI babies. You know what I mean?
Telling you this is, at least in my experience, my kids are really good in saying, okay, you're going too fast or you're going too slow. We can speed this up.
Okay.
I take a lot from my kids.
Okay.
I love that question though, Denise, because as a teacher, you're having to put on a whole different mindset. And if you're teaching an accelerated course alongside some very general course with maybe some more struggling math learners, then boy, that can be a challenge to have to in the course of a day switch your mindset and your focus in that way. That could be a challenge. Hey, I want to point out a couple quick things that are on the screen. Chess, first of all, mentioned use the time after testing to teach those accelerated skills. So, in our middle school courses, if you're able to keep up pacing with the scope and sequence just in normal circumstances, you typically are going to have some time after testing, and that's a great, great tip right there. Obviously, you want to accelerate and have more than what's even in that regular scope and sequence, but at least that's there, and take a look at that and how you're going to use that time. Rachel also mentioned consider strengths and weaknesses of that particular group. and this is wisdom right here, it does vary from year to year. Great point. And you know, however you find best to assess those kids as they come in, maybe it's you're able to get some test scores, maybe you're able to talk to their prior grade teacher for the bulk of the kids that you have. That's a little tougher for our 6th grade teachers, but do the best you can in making those assessments early on, and that'll give you some insight as to how to approach these courses. And then Charis and I had talked about this recently, I think, didn't we, Charis, about the summer learning, summer packet?
Yeah, and like I don't mean from going from 5th to 6th grade, but after a student's already been in accelerated class during 6th grade, I think if they, in order to stay in that accelerated pace, that this would be something good for them to continue for accelerated 7th and accelerated 8th.
Yeah, I love the idea. I actually did teach some middle school math for a time, and we had summer math programs, just like the English teachers had summer reading. Now, I would say that when I came into that, I was overwhelmed by it. They had these giant packets of stuff that went home, and it was trying to cover everything. It just seemed unnecessary. So I would think if we were going to do some summer packets, we would try to make it as engaging as possible and also very focused. So obviously, I'm guessing it's probably too late for that this year unless your school already does something like that. But definitely something I would love for us to dig into and do a good job of next summer, and at least making some resources available for schools and teachers who want to use them based on some good sound foundations and, you know, fundamentals there and ideas. Anything else along this line about just some good advice for people going into this, to teaching this course? Love this conversation.
Have fun.
So they can call you if they're not having fun, and you'll help them out with that, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Also,
anything else?
Yes.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Also, while we're teaching, make sure that we really differentiate. Some were concerned. I know this year I had a challenge in my accelerated classes that even there, I still had some students with some wide ranges of gaps. So I started doing a lot of performance assessments, and I started seeing those gaps close. So we did a lot of PBL projects to where we were able to go from concrete to abstract and introduce real world application, and you could really start seeing the light bulbs come on. And they were able to have those conversations. So where the students that were a little bit weaker in certain areas, they were able to really make those gains. And the students that were already ahead, because, you know, a lot of times when we have the students that are the top of the class, if we're not careful, we'll cripple those students and having them in our small group instruction, and they'll wind up being the peer tutor, and we're not careful, those students will stop growing. So those students are still able to keep growing, and you're able to have those conversations to where us as the teachers, we begin to be the facilitators. And then the class becomes to be student-led. And then you're really able to see those gains and growth. So that was a major accomplishment, because at the beginning of the year, I had some major gaps. In 6th grade, a lot of times, well, this particular year, it was a while before we could get into the computer lab, quote unquote. I was able to get a cart before long. So it was a while before we was able to do the diagnostic test. So I took an old 5th grade LEAP practice test, and I used that as my diagnostic the first week of school. So I was really able to do some data-driven instruction. And, you know, way before everybody was talking about with 360, well, I already had my data. So I was able to go. So that helped me with RTI. That helped me with grouping. That even helped me with multiple intelligence, you know, putting them in the right group to where they could grow.
Awesome, thank you, Ms. Henderson. And Ms. Henderson, you weren't in with us when we did our introductions. Would you just, earlier we just said our names and school and the courses we teach. Would you let everybody know? And for everybody, just make sure you know, I told you Ms. Glass is on our task force. Ms. Henderson is also on our task force, and thankful to have her with us in Caddo and at her school. So Ms. Henderson, would you do a quick introduction?
Yes, sir. My name is Sarika Robinson Henderson. The last year I taught 6th grade math and accelerated at Broadmoor Middle Laboratory School.
Awesome, thank you. Glad you're with us this morning.
Yes, sir. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Had a lot of difficulties this spring and summer, and so if you're a praying person, keep her in your prayers.
Yes, sir, I am.
We're glad you're able to be with us.
Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, this is a review of our second session from yesterday, but I've included these slides. Again, these slides will be shared with you. It's probably going to be over the weekend or Monday morning at the latest before I can get these slides posted and sent out to everybody. But this is kind of the process that we went through. If you were not in our 10 a.m. session yesterday, I'll just kind of do a quick overview. As we started to dig into what unfinished learning actually means, we went to the prior grade. So for sixth grade, we went back to fifth grade, and I got with our elementary math supervisor in Caddo, and she showed me these were the standards that would have been missed according to the fifth grade pacing guide. And then we used the coherence map to project those standards forward into sixth grade. And this is a little overwhelming to look at. The sixth grade is the worst looking document, but if those standards that we just looked at right there from fifth grade were not taught, which you have to, this is a very broad brushstroke, and you have to be careful about taking this too literally, because the fact is, and I think you guys know this, just because these standards weren't taught during that time frame of the quarantine doesn't mean that they weren't addressed prior to that time, okay? But these standards would have been taught in some form during the quarantine time, according to the pacing chart. So this is a very loose, I don't even know what the word is. Loose is not the right word. It's raw, and it needs to be fine-tuned a lot. And so we're working on that still. But this is what we did. We took those standards that would have been covered during the, in fact, I actually noted on this one, you see some asterisks there that said that there were 3 of those standards that should have been touched on in a prior unit. So then we projected them forward, and the lessons that would have involved standards coming out of those fifth grade standards are on the screen now. And again, that's probably not near as bad as it looks. Again, you might have a lesson there that is covered in let's say lesson 3.12, but it may be just one of 3 standards, and it may be a very low priority standard in that particular lesson. So the dilemma may not be as bad as it seems in most cases. Could be worse than it seems in others, but I don't think this picture is truly as scary as it looks at first sight. So yeah, we're going to try to fine tune this a lot and give you some more specifics, but you have to just understand that. So in our scope and sequence now, in our updated version of our scope and sequence, you're going to see a red letter UL next to each of these lessons. And what that indicates is that there could be some potential for what we're calling unfinished learning. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily going to be a big problem, but it's just sort of a little warning sign, just in case. And then we mentioned yesterday, if you do not see that red UL in front of a lesson, it doesn't automatically clear the path and say, oh, these kids are going to know this, they're going to be ready for this automatically. Because, we already know from prior years that we had learning gaps before any kind of quarantine. But we're just trying to provide guidance. And again, we're working to fine tune this so that it's a little more, we're trying to get as much information to make it as legitimate as possible. Right now, it's just the very first part of a process that we've gone through. And it took a lot of time. And then we did the same thing for sixth grade. We said, okay, if teachers were on pace for sixth grade, they would have missed these standards during the quarantine. Once again, doesn't mean these standards weren't taught in other lessons prior to the quarantine, but they would definitely have been taught during the quarantine according to our pacing guide. And if you project those standards forward into seventh grade, the seventh grade standards that these standards lead into, then those would apply in these seventh grade lessons. So you see here at first glance, it's not near as imposing as the sixth grade document. One of the brightest spots about this is it doesn't seem to kick in as far as the quarantine effect until Unit 5, which is way into the school year. So at just first glance at this, seventh grade teachers seem to have a whole lot less to worry about with regard to the quarantine, especially in the first half of the school year. Doesn't mean you're not going to have any problems in Unit 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. But based on those numbers and how we projected that forward, this is what it looks like. For those of you who are new to Caddo, you might not know these brown highlighted, the brown font here is those lessons that have notes in our scope and sequence that dub them to be either optional lessons or lessons where you might be able to abbreviate and combine and save some time. That's all that means. Okay, so, just I'd love to hear some thoughts on this. And I didn't make a Nearpod slide for this, but just if you have any verbal input, based on this unfinished learning dilemma that we seem to be facing, what are your thoughts on how these courses, the accelerated courses, might need to be modified? I know, again, when Charis and I talked about this, we were both just kind of like, wow, these are probably the hardest hit courses because we're already crunched with time and have to cover so much material. And now we've got these potential gaps that could make this much more difficult. Any concerns about unfinished learning or suggestions for how we attack it? Go ahead, Trey.
I think what Ms. Henderson said earlier about just using that diagnostic to see where those weaknesses are at the beginning of the year would be, beneficial.
For sure. And I think I mentioned this yesterday, there is a lot of discussion around how we're going to do diagnostics this year. There's been talk about breaking the diagnostic into parts so that we don't do it all at once, but we break those parts into what material is coming next. There's talk about using other diagnostic tools outside of the state diagnostic assessment, which in my opinion is not the best way to do a diagnostic. But so any suggestions you have on that, let us know, and we'll see how we can get those suggestions in front of the powers who are making those decisions. Definitely a great point. Somebody else.
I'm new to this, but as a parent of a 10-year-old who's going to be a sixth grader, if you were to send me an email as a teacher and say, I'd like your student to review the following things, maybe on Khan Academy, or the following documents that, that if he just to review them for upcoming year, I would take that serious. Now, I don't know that maybe adding extra work to somebody, but of course, if I was teaching sixth grade, it'd be adding extra work to me. So, but what I'm saying as a teacher, if my students are prepared for class before they get there, I'm going to feel better about their learning process and not holding somebody up who hadn't prepared maybe. And not every parent, I guess, will be that involved. Some parents will, some parents won't. But as an educator myself, I would take that document real serious and say, hey, buddy, we need to work on these things about an hour a day during the summer. Just like we have my son do an hour of Khan Academy every day to get ready for sixth grade. He's been doing algebra in Khan Academy every day for an hour. Those kind of things to me help your student be a better student and help your class run smoother, because if my students are ready for class, all I got to do is say, do you understand what I'm teaching you? And they say no. I say, well, let me work on that with you. I don't know. Like the diagnostic is a great idea. I love the diagnostic idea.
Yeah, and I from what I'm hearing that you're saying there, Trey, is sort of a summer assignment kind of thing, right? That we were talking about earlier, possibly. Yeah,
I mean, if that's something that, I mean, it may require a lot of, I don't know the whole process of all this because I'm still learning. I'm in the teaching academy, but to me, if a teacher who's been experienced at this knows a way to do that kind of thing, I'd love it for my son. I mean, if he's not ready for math, I'm going to be disappointed if he's not ready, because he's trying, I think. So
yeah, and it's a great suggestion, a great idea. The deal we run into there, it kind of goes back to what we tried to do this spring once we were in quarantine. We made out some pretty elaborate plans. Some teachers use those plans very specifically and intentionally. Other teachers had their own kind of plans based on what they had taught their students, and they customized it based on what they had already done in the school year. And that was all great. The problem we had was such a small percentage, relatively speaking, of students who actually participated. And then to be able to hold them accountable to that is pretty much impossible. Now, I'm not saying that means we don't even put it out there for those who want it and whose parents will help in pushing kids to get it done. But it doesn't change all the dilemma for the teachers coming in, because now you might have a few kids who are more prepared, but you still probably have quite a few who are not. So I think we're still going to have to address that problem through diagnostics and other things as kids come in. But yeah, if we had a few more who were beefed up in the topics and ready to go, maybe they are able to provide some assistance in small groups and things like that, to keep the class moving a little better. Great point. Well, we're about to wind this down. Any other thoughts on the unfinished learning or anything else we've talked about as we just kind of try to wrap this up? So now, as I said at the beginning, this is not me just giving you a bunch of information. This was a discussion. This is, I'm actually getting more information from you than you're getting from me. And I hope you're getting good information from each other along the way here. But in these next steps, I just put, let's take some time when you can. I hate that teachers have to work so hard during the summer because you desperately need that summer break after all we've been through. But, most of you do. You do work during the summer and prepare. So I would just kind of point to a couple of things here to review that 6th or 7th grade scope and sequence document, whichever applies to you. I would ask for you to email me ideas that you have based on today and any other thing that comes to mind. If you're like me, sometimes I'll go through a session like this and then I'll go to sleep at night and I'll wake up about 2 in the morning thinking about some idea, and which is probably not healthy, but I'll try to write those things down or type them in my phone or something. And then, we already have some indication in our scope and sequence where there are some potential ways to abbreviate topics, combine lessons, that sort of thing. But I think this year we're going to have to put a little more effort and thought into that. We may have to cut some more corners than we normally would just because of this unfinished learning challenge that we're facing. So if you have time to dig into that a little bit more and try to think about ways to abbreviate without compromising too much of the learning goals of the course. But trying to keep these kids on track so that they're still able to take Algebra 1 in the 8th grade if that was their plan. We also are going to have to be honest in some situations about where we see kids who didn't do the spring work and they're in an accelerated class and they're just too far behind. And we're going to have to be able to speak up to our administrators, counselors, the parents maybe, and say, look, I don't know if this kid at this point is now going to be able to continue on this accelerated pathway and move into 8th grade Algebra 1. So we may have to make some of those hard calls. Now, I know those of you who've been teaching this for a while, or you've been teaching for a while, you know that parents will always win those arguments. And if they continue to push their kids in through that process, then, we really don't usually have much of a say in that. And, that's okay. And then the kid may end up being successful after all. But if you see that kid that's just struggling, and again, you find out they didn't do anything in the spring after the quarantine, they just sat around and watched TV and didn't do any of the assignments teachers were giving them online, then we may need to at least point some of that out to our administrators and let them help us to move forward and how to move forward with those decisions. All right, we're at the end of our time, and I'm willing to stay on for a few minutes. I'd love to hear any more thoughts you have, questions. I may not be able to answer them, but you're welcome to ask them, and somebody else may be able to answer them.
Mr. Vance, is the state going to take into account all of this for the testing next year?
I don't know, but I would be very surprised if they didn't. I just don't know what that's going to look like. My guess is that if we are able to start school this fall with any sort of normalcy, then we would definitely expect state tests in the spring. I would also guess, based on the people that I talk to at the State Department from time to time, that they would be doing some initial assessments in the first semester before the final decisions would be made. That would be based on feedback from their own state personnel who go out and observe and talk to administrators, and also feedback from district superintendents. It's not a decision that would be made lightly, but I know that the decision always pushes toward giving the assessments. You might have noticed they didn't announce that we were not going to have spring assessments this year until way after everybody kind of figured we weren't. But They didn't make that official announcement until much later, just because that's one of the last things the State Department wants to do, is to shut down state testing. In fact, I believe they've already made plans to do some summer testing for high school this summer, maybe mostly in kids who need to graduate kind of thing. But I think I've already been hearing about some dates for that. So state testing is a pretty important thing, whether that's good or not in your mind. It is what it is. So it's going to take a lot for us not to have state testing in the spring. That's how I would answer that, but I don't know.
Well, I'm good with the state testing. I just didn't know if they were going to adjust some of the things on there, being that the kids had missed so much, if they were going to adjust the test.
I would be very surprised if they did that, because it's such an elaborate process to put those tests together in the first place. That would be extremely complicated and costly, and so I would be surprised if they made an effort toward that. I think every effort will be made to giving the tests as they were already kind of scheduled and planned to be given. So.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Again, don't take my answers on that as gospel, but that's my understanding based on my own experiences.
Okay.
Hey Roger, while we're just sitting here, I wanted to mention something that we started doing at CMM the last couple of years that made a huge difference for me as a teacher this year. We presented to our administration team that so many, I'd say, well, not so many, I'd say 10 to 20% of our kids who were continuing in 7th and 8th grade accelerated courses were just not either committed to the work or were just not ready. And so we started doing I guess a rubric that either we not, okay, hang on, let me think how to phrase this.
Like qualifying kids for the next level?
Yes, and so we sent the letter to every parent at the end of the year and let them know that either A, we recommend this student based on this criteria, or B, we don't recommend this student. And even though the parents do have the last word and they are, the final say, at least they knew that we didn't recommend them. So I'd say even if we didn't, maybe only 1 or 2 of those still ended up in the next accelerated class. For the most part, they listened and we appreciated that. But we also let the students know all year long, like, these are the criteria for you to be recommended for the next year accelerated. And it made such a difference that this year, my 8th grade kids that took Algebra 1, I didn't have 1B. And I'm not an easy A. So it made a big
I would say that the reason you had the parent buy-in is because they were getting that information throughout the year. I think that was a key point. I've proposed that to do things like that district-wide, particularly with regard to 8th grade algebra and kids getting in there. And I've been shut down to say that is a school-by-school decision.
Right, for sure. It's just something people might want to mention to their administration.
Yeah, and the thing is, what I've been told on that is that each school would need to create their own criteria, and because of the diversity in Caddo, those criteria would also vary. So I get that, but yeah, I think taking what you guys have done there at CMM and just sharing that out and saying, hey, you probably want to have some criteria here that motivates these kids to keep working hard, because if they don't, then there is that possibility they could be pulled out of this pathway. Right. And that's when we talked about this last year with all the principals, that was a big thing that I said. I wasn't necessarily talking about defining criteria. We did a little bit. But I said, don't feel like kids are locked into this path. If you identify a 6th grader for 6th grade accelerated, and then by the end of that year, the teacher recognizes that they're not ready to move on to 7th grade accelerated, then that's okay. They can be moved out.
Right.
But yeah, I think the way you guys did it with that communication and having clear guidelines is definitely the way you have to go. So I appreciate that, and something I need to share if I get a chance to meet with principals this summer, which I haven't heard anything about that yet. Usually we've already met with principals once by this time, and I get to usually meet with them 2 or 3 times during the summer, and so far I haven't heard anything about that. So, but as soon as I do, that'll be one of my bullet points. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right. Well, going once, twice, thrice, I'm going to shut it down if you don't interrupt me first, and hopefully I will see you virtually throughout the day today. If not, I hope you have a wonderful summer. Please make time for yourself and your family, and make sure you have balance in your life so that you come back to whatever we come back to in the fall, refreshed and ready to go. Take care.